Good morning, everyone. This is Adriana Camarda from the Domestic Violence Division here at the Department of Family and Support Services. I just want to say good morning, and I want to introduce to you who else I have in the room today with me. I have Brian Essenberg from the Department of Housing.
Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here.
Brian will be available for any questions or concerns about the capital funding part of the RFP. And also I have Julia Talbot from the Department of Family and Services.
Good morning.
And the master engineer, I have Thomas Mose with me as well, who's handling all of the webinar.
Hi, everyone.
Also, Thomas wants me to remind you that we will be taking questions if you have them during the presentation, which you can type into the dashboard on your right in the webinar software. And we may stop and address those questions as we go, or you could put your question there that we will address at the final Q&A at the end. Whichever you prefer. If you don't prefer to speak, you can definitely type your question in the dashboard. Okay, that being said, welcome to the Department of Family and Support Services Domestic Violence Interim Shelter RFP webinar. Today, we will be going over a review of the DFSS strategic framework and how it applies to our RFPs moving forward, an overview of this domestic violence interim shelter itself. Then we will be doing key dates and deadlines. And then, like I said, at the end, we'll be having a Q&A session for any questions that may come up. Just a little bit of information for you. We will also be recording this webinar and posting it, so if you have to leave or whatever reason, or you can watch it at a later time. Okay, here we are. This is an introduction, a little bit of a background on the strategic framework here at DFSS. Back in mid-2016, DFSS took on a strategic framework development process in order to streamline our providers and our programs. It will focus more on not measuring number of outputs and numbers of persons served, but more on client progress and outcomes. So the first phase of the strategic framework was internal, focusing on setting goals and priorities for each division, including the Homeless Division as well as the Domestic Violence Division. And then the next phase was incorporating all of those goals and outcomes that we wanted to measure into the RFP process. And that was engaging delegates to improve services and outcomes in RFPs. So the RFP itself, if you have seen it in the past, is fundamentally changed in 2018 for 2019 funding. It's more focused on performance measurement, outcome goals, and then also actively trying to manage those contracts to drive continuous improvement. As you know, DFSS works primarily through its provider network to provide these services, and we do very limited direct service. So we try to partner with you during the RFP process in order to better provide services to the citizens of Chicago. Having said that, let's go over a little bit about how our RFPs changed in the previous year to reflect our strategic framework goal. We took the RFPs and reorganized them and revamped them to look at some of the major things that focus on outcomes and tracking performance. It was also a better flow of information and communication going back through the provider and DFSS about best practices, how you provide your services, and how you track your data. The shift was so that we could go more from measuring outputs and activities, how you're housing people and how you're providing DV services, to better align with our priorities and our outcomes that we wanted to get in the community. So you'll see that there were a lot of different changes to the RFP itself. We went with selection criteria and performance requirements that you had to have in the RFP, and they were closely aligned with the application questions that you saw in the RFP application. And then we posed also questions about how you use your data to inform your work and how you track that data and track client success. Last year's RFP sort of followed this pattern. We gave you a really good understanding of where DFSS wanted to go with our outcome goals and gave you data sets of what we had and how we wanted to measure performance data. And we incorporated those into the selection criteria. And most RFPs were scored on these 4 areas that you see here. The first being the strength of the proposed program. We asked you pointed questions about your program that you provide and your services. The second thing was program performance outcomes and quality, where we asked you how you measure your performance and how do you, your project, actually use that data to measure performance and track client outcomes that impact your program? And do you use that data to improve your program? And then the third area was organizational capacity, your staffing, your agency finances as well, and were you able to provide the services that we were asking for? And finally, reasonable cost and budget justification and leverage of funds. This is where we would ask you, obviously, your budget request and all of your other resources that you would be bringing to the project. All of those pointed questions then led to the application questions that we developed that were more pointed about your program and how you work with the target population and how you provide your services. Okay, that was a very high-level review of the strategic framework process. And then we get into the Homeless Services Division and what that change meant to homeless services. You'll note that if you're not familiar with the homeless shelter RFP that was released in 2018 for 2019 funding, it did very much align with Chicago's Plan 2.0 from the Continuum al Care. They have many models of services that they provide, domestic violence shelters being one of them. All of the models contain the core values that the Chicago COC includes. They would be the housing first approach, harm reduction, trauma-informed, partner building, as well as cultural competency and non-discriminatory practices and other things. We have many, many housing models under the program models chart for the Chicago Continuum al Care. But overall, DFSS also in its RFP wanted to maintain overall system capacity. And what that means is that we needed different numbers of beds for our different components of the system, whether they be emergency beds or whether they be DV beds or whether they be family beds. We also have to look at the overall picture of whether we have enough beds to meet the demand. And then finally, coordinated entry. Coordinated entry was implemented back in 2016 to the permanent housing support program and now is making its way into the other program models. As you may or may not know, it's actually now making its way into the DV program, our DV population. We ask that all of our providers that apply for RFP funding from DFSS comply with coordinated entry system. It is a conduit, if you will, of affordable housing in the city of Chicago that comes through DFSS and the COC. And it's based on a system of vulnerability assessment and appropriate housing. And then finally, of course, homeless services, we encourage partnerships, linkages, and collaboration and coordination amongst not only the provider network, but with other funders as well. This slide shows you in last year's RFP, all of the shelter programs that was available, funding programs for shelters that was available from DFSS, starting from your basic needs shelter, emergency shelter, all the way to your enhanced or specialized services. Today here, we're talking about a special RFP for interim shelter 3A, as you'll see the arrow pointing to, is a domestic violence interim housing shelter. So the way this chart works is that you, as a domestic violence shelter, will encompass most of the things that come into the basic needs and system connections, strong case management and services, and you'll also be providing enhanced domestic violence services in the interim housing shelter. So just to reiterate, all of the RFPs that will be submitted under this RFP, or all the applications that will be submitted under this RFP, will be for Model 3A. This also is a slide from the last year's RFP that shows you basically what programs we are looking for under this RFP. So any proposed program will have to absolutely meet the bottom of the triangle, which is basic needs. We'll also have to provide strong case management and services and access to benefit checks and housing placement searches. And then also, they will also be having specialized services and wraparound services for DV clients. Okay. In this chart, which is a little overwhelming, you'll notice that is the domestic violence shelter overview. So we've broken down basically the RFP here for you with our goal, our service overviews, and that you will be providing enhanced services, which means you'll be all the way up on the triangle and providing all the services that are available in the shelter system. And your target population will be families with children that are literally homeless. And then we've combined the key performance metrics, not only of the interim shelter model within the homeless division, but we've incorporated some of the domestic violence division performance metrics as well, as you will be providing both the shelter metric or performance, both the shelter services as well as DV services. Okay. Here is another deep dive into the triangle, the top of the triangle, which is the enhanced services. As I stated, you'll be building on the basic elements. You'll be a 24-hour, shelter provision. You'll provide crisis and domestic violence counseling and safety planning and assessment and legal advocacy. You'll also be providing high-quality case management that's focused on housing placement, either through your resources or through the coordinated entry system once that is available to DV, and increasing income. And here are some of the things that we ask that service providers in the domestic violence shelter provide. And then also, of course, interested in creative approaches to diversion and housing solutions. And what that means is that in the RFP, we'll be asking you questions about how you serve this target population and how you overcome their barriers to housing as well as income. I was asked by Thomas to remind you that you may type any questions that you have onto the dashboard on the right that can either be answered as we go along or as we get to the final Q&A session. Also, for those of you that joined us after the webinar, we're recording this webinar and we'll post it and make it available on the DFSS YouTube channel, and we will send you the link to that recording when it's available. Okay, thank you, Tom. Past performance. This is the part of the RFP that was almost somewhat new for 2019. We asked in the application for agencies submitting proposals to talk about their past performance. For DV shelters, that means that they don't have HMIS reports to provide us with, but you can discuss the last 12 months of your data in this section of the application right here. This is the part of the RFP where we are looking at how you performed on these key indicators on the slide. And it's also the part of the RFP to address your performance here as well, whether you met these key indicators or not, and the reasons why you did not. A lot of the RFPs, applications that we've received in the previous year listed that they had all of these key indicators, but what we're really looking for full points on this question is that you address each and every one and how your agency performs on these key indicators. Okay. Then also the RFP goes over some other key program requirements that you need to address throughout your RFP application. Some of them could be, moving on from housing first, how your agency practices family preservation in a family shelter. DV shelters are also asked to be using InfoNet and tracking exit and entry into the program. What that means is that we realize that you're not entering data into HMIS, but we do ask and mandate that you use InfoNet for this project and track with DFSS your exit and entries into a program. We also ask that you have written policies and procedures for intake and grievance and conflict resolution, of course, that you're applying with the HERTH Act, and above all else, in this special population, confidentiality of client records is important. And even though you are a DV shelter, you are mandated to participate in the PIT count every year, as well as the DFSS shelter bed clearinghouse. So now we get into this RFP. The purpose of this RFP was to fund additional domestic violence beds. Currently, DFSS funds about 140 DV beds. And the Continuum of Care funds approximately another 140, which of course totals to 280. There is a very large gap in demand on domestic violence beds. So in 2018, the City Council approved an additional surcharge on Airbnb or home share funds, and that 2% is what is funding this RFP. We are hoping to add on at least another additional 70 domestic violence beds to that DFSS funded of 140 to close a little bit of the gap that we have in demand for these really specialized and enhanced beds. And so that is the purpose of this RFP. We are really looking for programs that are not only have proven track records on serving this population, but also that can have a space available pretty much quickly to be able to start housing these populations. And I do see we have a question. Sorry to interrupt, but that question was about posting the slides. Of course, this presentation, the recording, as well as the presentation will be posted for anyone after this date. All right, now we get to the specialized part of the RFP as well, for those of you that know a little bit about homeless services. This RFP, because it is very flexible funding, we also are, for the initial year, allowing agencies with proposals to ask for capital funding for either a renovation or a remodeling of their space. Again, most of the questions on the application and the strength of the program and the capacity, we would like, of course, for you to have a site that is immediately available and ready to start housing clients, but we realize that's not the reality of the situation. And so your application will be scored on, of course, your availability to start housing families as quickly as possible. However, if you do need renovation funds, we have a limited amount of money under this RFP set aside for capital funding requests. In the RFP, as I said, you're limited to the $7,300 per bed that you request. So in other words, if you are requesting 10 beds, just to make it a round even number, your maximum limit is $73,000 in renovation costs. With that funding, it will be immediately available. Not only that, but the funding will expire by 12/31/2019. So that pretty much, the amount of funding that's available limits the types of renovations that you can do. They cannot be extensive renovations or acquisitions, obviously. And also they need to be expended in a short amount of time. And also the funding request must be accompanied by the DV shelter scope of work, which is an attachment to this application, where you explain and provide more details on what types of renovation will be needed for your site. And as the RFP states, also DFSS reserves the right to do a site visit on any site that you choose or put in the proposal. At this time, if you have any questions or more specific questions about capital requests, you can either ask them in the Q&A. Brian is here available to answer all of those questions, or you can just submit them to me at a later date, and I will get Brian to provide me some consulting services, hopefully for free. Okay. Now I'm going to turn it over. Just one other comment about the RFP in general. Well, I can get to it later. I'm going to turn it over to Julia now to give you a little bit of tidbits on application process. Julia?
Good morning. So here's a few, we have a little bit of advice here for our applicants. I'm hoping that probably many of you already have some familiarity with the e-procurement system. The system is the procurement system for the entire city of Chicago. So everybody who applies online for everything from DV services to road repair goes through this system. It is, which means that, you know, like many one-size-fits-all things, it is not always a perfect alignment. To that end, we always encourage people to start early. Sometimes this system actually is very good at doing what it does. It does not crash on our end, but I have done enough RFPs to know that it will time out, and sometimes it will crash on your end. And so I can only encourage you to start early. And by early, I mean not within 36 hours of the due date, because that seems to be when people have the most problems with their computers. We have many, many fine things online, and you can call me to in terms of technical assistance. I have a lot of PowerPoints I can send people, screenshots, giving very explicit instructions on how to do just about anything in this system. You can call me, and my number is in the application, or you can call the OBM hotline, which is specifically set up for e-procurement. Like myself, the OBM hotline works Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. You can email me. I will email you back within 24 hours. So those are the things that those are the the technical end of this. So I would encourage you to just to kind of go over this slide a lot, start early, take advantage of the resources that we have. I can only encourage you to read the RFP that we have written for you, describing our programmatic scope and our expectations. Many of the questions, if you're looking for guidance on what you think we might be looking for in terms of an applicant, if you read the RFP document, you will find that we describe that fairly explicitly. So you don't actually have to, it's not a shot in the dark. The answers are sort of there for you. Our application, all the text box narrative questions are limited to 4,000 characters. 4,000 characters means a character. It also means a space. It means a comma or any other kinds of punctuation. We always appreciate it when people use spell check, and that you upload the required attachments, which in this case are budget sheets, 1 or 2, depending on what you're exactly applying for. And then in terms of pressing submit, there's to go through the submission process, you go through a couple of different screens. Often you will get an error message when you're beginning the submission process because maybe you didn't answer a question, or maybe you didn't fill out some aspect of the application. If you read the error message that will appear while you're doing submit, it will tell you what you need to do next. But I've gotten a lot of phone calls where people sort of panic about that error message, and then they just see error and they don't read past that word. So I can only suggest, again, start early. We love it when people submit before the deadline, like 24 hours even. It's very encouraging for us. To that end, we cannot accept late applications. So I understand that things happen. I understand that computers crash. I understand that everybody has a certain amount of time pressure and deadline, but we cannot accept late applications. This system does not allow us to accept late applications. So the only way we can accept an application past the deadline is to reopen and repost the entire RFP. You can submit your application and you can amend it later if you want. So you can submit it, and then if you decide, oh, I forgot this, or I want to do that, you can actually pull it back. It's not very difficult to do. If you're having problems, I can send you lots of screenshots on how to do that. The due date is not March 26th, as it says on the screen. I'm sorry. The due date for this application is June 14th, which is not March 26th. However, it is still at noon. All of our RFPs are due at noon, so that we only really stressed you out for half of a day, right? Mm-hmm. But again, yeah, late applications will not be accepted. Not to sound too punitive, but these RFPs of ours are out. They're out always for at least a month, and so I can only encourage you to get started early, to submit early, and to have a more relaxed experience writing this as opposed to a more hectic one. I think in terms of this, we'll go back to the key dates and deadlines. Adriana is, of course, the person with the greatest depth of knowledge and the person that you should call if you're having questions about the budget or about any aspect of the program. You may call me if you are having problems with the e-procurement system itself, and if you cannot get a hold of me, you can always call the e-procurement hotline, which is 312-744-0358. And it's always, you know, that number floats around a lot. It's not hard to find, but it's in the RFP, or you can call me or you can email me. The application is due on June 14th at noon again, and we hope to have the contracts begin. Actually, they would have to begin on July 1st, not June 1st.
Actually, that's not a typo.
It's not a typo?
I will explain why.
Okay.
All right. The contract will begin on June 1st if a proposal is actually funded and your site is pretty much ready to begin occupancy, with the exception of purchasing some items. So if your proposal is ready for occupancy, starting the contract on June 1st gives you additional funding to prepare for occupancy. In the real world, a store doesn't open and isn't prepared to house people without any linens, furniture, and staff of any kind. So we recognize that. So those proposals of funding will be awarded at a contract date of June 1st. If you are making a capital request, the funding date will be determined at a later date depending on the funding request that you make. As I said, this RFP is a little special. DFSS rarely allows for capital costs to be included with an RFP. It is only for this year, or the funding is only available for this year. And that contract, if awarded, the start date will be determined based on your financial needs for the project. And I just wanted to reiterate too that there is another slide that's coming that has additional resources that Julia mentioned on the e-procurement site. In this slide that will be made available to everyone, you'll have links to where you can find this presentation, where you can find the application, how to start an application in e-procurement, as well as training materials for e-procurement. Have I missed anything? Right.
You know, all of those, the support of the e-procurement system, those are all in the RFP as well. And the PowerPoint that talks about how to start an application is also available on the DFSS website under the information about this particular RFP. So there are a lot of resources should you need them.
Okay, that is all of the information that we have for you today. You are going to be placed out of mute mode, that if you wanted to call in with a live question, or we can start beginning to answer the typed up questions, whichever we receive. So let's start with the first one. Does DFSS have a preference to fund shelter programs or create bed space in any particular area of Chicago or community areas? Obviously, we would like a shelter to be in all community areas, but we recognize the reality that Chicago presents, and that we are probably looking for a building that already exists for this proposed site. And so that we are not looking at any specific community areas, basically. We would just like to be able to provide services everywhere. Okay. Just to be clear, this RFP is for new beds, not to renew existing funding. Right. This is for new domestic violence interim shelter beds, not existing renewals. Those renewal beds have already been funded. Also, is capital available for existing projects? Can you move the arrow, Thomas? Or only to support additional beds? No. So if you already have an existing project, capital funding is not available to you, only if you're asking for expansion. So let's say you're an existing interim shelter, you're an existing shelter provider, and you're going to add on 10 more beds to your program, but that expansion requires capital funding or renovation, yes, we would consider it. If you have existing funded beds under DFSS, but you need renovation money, no. It has to be coupled with the new beds, basically. If you want to talk, you can click on the hand in the dashboard on your right, and that we can hear you through the screen as well. Okay, we are going to wait for a few minutes to see if anybody wants to submit any additional questions, either through the dashboard by typing, or if you want to raise your hand, and that way everybody can hear your question. So we haven't received any additional questions. Of course, I am available to answer questions individually if you want to email me or call me at a later time. I'll be in and out of the office this week at a conference, but I will be available to return calls after that. I want to thank you for everybody that participated on the panel and the engineer and everybody that participated out there on this conference or this webinar. And thank you.